Hello friends, it's been another wonderful month on the channel. Time to look at all the lovely comments you've been leaving. First off, I did a video as a collaboration with Peter Coffin about the news and whether you can have a duty to be informed, and if so, whether that would include reading the news or what. And Doblestorm left a brilliant comment that made me totally reevaluate the whole episode, because they said that their psychiatrist had recommended to them that they not read the news. And that made me think, oh well, if there is a duty to be informed and part of that is watching the news, then presumably in certain cases that duty would be mitigated, or maybe it's more what Peter suggested and we shouldn't be looking at it through like a duty framework at all, and it's more just like sharing information is how we socialize. And so if certain kinds of social activity are uniquely damaging or upsetting for you, then of course you would avoid them. Like if you had a bad knee, you would avoid going rock climbing as a social activity, right? That kind of just threw all the questions of the video into sharp relief in a really nice way, so thank you. R. Diaz pointed out that when I was talking about active and passive voice in news headlines, both of the examples I gave were actually in the active voice. And a few other people pointed this out as well. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Apparently I just like made a mistake and got that wrong. Could anybody sort of translate the headline that I said was in the passive voice actually into the passive voice? Can anyone do that in the comments so I can like understand more what the distinction is? The problem I was talking about in news headlines, I have seen called passive voice before, but I guess from reading the comments that it's like that's like a specific grammatical thing that I wasn't quite tuning into there, so apologies for that. Advent3456 asked, when I was in the play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which we talked about in that episode, which part did I play? So I was in it twice. The first time I played a character who's just called the player, that's his name. He's not like the villain, but he's kind of, well, more just like force of nature really. And then the second time I did it, I was Hamlet. Mies Mystinen said something very interesting. They said they thought that the word duty could cause people to recede and put them off a moral theory. And I found that quite interesting because me personally, it doesn't make me feel that way, but I wonder if maybe that's some kind of sort of latent Englishness, or maybe it's something from my army cadet days. Maybe there's something in me, a little bit of kind of England expects every man to do his duty sort of thing. So I don't know. Does the word duty put you off the idea of a moral theory? Like, does the idea of having duties or kind of duties as corresponding to rights put you off in any way? Leave a comment. Probably depends what the duties are, I suppose. That would have been the clever answer. Vinicius Moraes said that if we have a duty to be informed, does that mean that we can have a corresponding duty to inform people? And ooh, I hadn't even considered that at all. That's not something that even occurred to me. I guess on paper the idea of having a duty to inform somebody seems, well, like I guess outside of certain like legal scenarios maybe seems a little weird. But then I started thinking, well, you know, maybe telling the truth. People say you can have a duty to tell the truth, and that's kind of like a duty to inform, isn't it? Or a duty to help other people could include in that as part of it a duty to inform them sometimes, maybe? Yeah, cool question. Before I did that video with Peter Coffin, I did another one on Plato. Litcrit said that I could have engaged a little bit more with the idea of the forms, maybe presented some arguments as to why somebody might think they were plausible, and they thought that I was maybe like a little bit dismissive of it and didn't really engage with the forms seriously, and a few other people have that criticism too. I think that's probably a fair cop, to be honest. You know, in retrospect, I wish I'd talked a little bit more about types and tokens. That maybe would have helped people get the idea across to people a little bit more. I'm also generally just skeptical about the existence of abstract objects, so I think I was possibly just a little bit biased against Plato there, so fair cop. Similarly, Abe Chang too was a little bit frustrated that I took Plato to be speaking literally about the forms, and they actually had a very interesting reading of Plato according to which the forms are more like something to do with definitions, and I actually really like that reading. Fair cop, again. At uni I was taught that he was being literal, and I do think that it gels better with the Phaedo and also with the Meno as well, if we take him as being literal, especially when he's talking about stuff like the immortality of the soul or about learning as recollection. I'm not entirely sure how the kind of your reading of the forms as definitional would fit in with that sort of stuff, but like I say, I do really like that reading of it. See You Later asked, wouldn't the highest form in Plato's hierarchy of forms be the form of form? And maybe, I'm not sure whether that would be in there somewhere, but then presumably the form of form, if it was somewhere in that chain, would exist, and therefore would also partake in the form of being and the form of good above that. So, someone beginning with L talked about the link between ideal selves and unhappiness. If you cast your minds back, you might remember that at the end of the Plato video I touched very, very briefly on ideal selves. I have a two-part series on that theory of mind that's been scripted. Part 1 is about like self-hatred and internalized racism, and then part 2 talks a lot about solitary confinement and that theory of mind as applied to what happens to prisoners in solitary. So I think you might really enjoy those videos, someone beginning with L. Someone beginning with L also wondered how Plato made that leap to essentially writing fan fiction about his teacher, Socrates. And they said, and this is interesting, they could imagine writing fan fiction about me, but not about any of their teachers in university. And yeah, I wonder what was going through Plato's head with that decision. And there's obviously something about like the parasocial relationship of YouTubers that makes writing fan fiction easier than the social relationship of like a classic teacher-student relationship. But then Plato would have learned at events called symposia, where philosophers would go and give lectures. And I wonder what that atmosphere was like, and like what it must have been like to have prompted that sort of feeling that he could have written Socrates into his stuff as a character. I guess we'll never know. As far as I'm aware, nobody's ever actually written any fan fiction about me, although plenty of people have said that they were going to, especially about me and Natalie from ContraPoints. Though if anybody has actually written any of that, I have yet to see it. Speaking of fans though, for being such a generous patron of the show, Andrew Kowalski got to ask me one question that I would answer here in front of everybody, and they chose to ask me, is there any sort of inquiry about learning? And I take it this is a reference to Meno's paradox, the paradox of inquiry, which we also talked about in the Plato episode. For those who need a refresher, Plato says that inquiry is impossible, and that's part of what motivates him to say that all learning is really just recollection of the forms. I don't really have any rigorous thoughts on this, but I have wondered for a while. You know, when you're trying to find something, you don't always know exactly what you're looking for, but like the missing puzzle piece in the jigsaw, you might know sort of roughly what shape it is, and also you might find something that could be a candidate for what you're looking for, and you could maybe test it. I've always thought that maybe Plato dismisses the idea of inquiry as part of learning a little bit too quickly. He talks about, he says, oh, if you know exactly what you're looking for, then you don't need to look for it, and if you don't, then you'll never find it. But like, he seems to think there's only two options there, whereas actually you could just sort of fudge it a little bit. Those are all the comments I have time for. Thank you very much to you for watching the show. Right now, as you're watching this, I'm at VidCon in California. So if you are in California and you are at VidCon and you see somebody wandering around who looks exactly like me, that's because it's me. Please come up and say hello. And for all of you who aren't at VidCon, I will leave you with the credits.